Hi, it's Jamie, Progressive's Employee of the Month, 2 months in a row. Leave a message at the... Hi, Jamie. It's me, Jamie. I just had a new idea for our song about the Name Your Price tool. So when it's like, tell us what you want to pay, hey, 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 and the trombone goes, blah, 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 and you say, we'll help you find coverage options to fit your budget. Then we just all do finger snaps while a choir goes, savings coming at ya, savings coming at ya. Yes? No? Maybe? Anyway, see your practice tonight. I got new lyrics for the rap break.
Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Welcome, everyone, to Creating a Family. Talk about infertility and adoption. Today we're going to be talking about infertility and genetics. This is a hot topic in our really large support group. We talk about genetics all the time. I mean, quite frankly, you can't read anything. You can't pick up any popular media and not see and hear and think about the influence of genetics on all aspects of our life. And today we're going to be talking about the influence of genetics on infertility. I hope you enjoy it as much as I have. Here's a sample of what you're going to hear.
Genetics is a component, but family history is neither overly reassuring nor should be overly concerning. It just should be part of a thorough history so that we can direct appropriate targeted testing and treatment.
I'm Dawn Davenport. I'm the Director of Creating a Family. We are the National Infertility and Adoption Education and Support Nonprofit, and you can find us online at creatingafamily.org. We create resources every week to help you on your infertility journey, to answer your questions. Our mission is to provide medically accurate, engaging information to the infertility patient community. And one thing that we think you would really enjoy is our multimedia guide for how to choose an infertility clinic. It has become the go-to resource for infertility patients at the very beginning of their journey when they're trying to figure out what the first steps they're going to take are. And one of the first steps is to get yourself to a specialist, and that means get yourself to an infertility clinic. We answer all of your questions. We give you lists of questions. We talk about how to assess the embryology lab. We talk about how to tease out which of the statistics that are available are the most meaningful. It is about 50-some-odd pages, just full of information, and you can get it on our website, creatingafamily.org. Hover over the word infertility and click on eGuides. The Creating a Family radio show is underwritten by our corporate sponsor, Ferring Pharmaceutical. Ferring has a free program they want you to know about, My Fertility Navigator. This program offers free one-on-one support for women who are struggling to get pregnant and are unsure of what to do. Once you enroll in the program, you will receive a personalized guidance from a live, dedicated fertility navigator who can provide important information about fertility and infertility, including things like provide a list of nearby fertility centers, help you figure out how to finance or how to afford infertility treatment, and discuss some of the treatment options you have. You can get more information about My Fertility Navigator by going to their website, myfertilitynav.com/CAF. This show, as well as all the resources provided by Creating a Family, could not happen without the generous support from our gold sponsors who believe in our mission of providing unbiased education and support to those struggling to create a family. Some of our wonderful gold sponsors include Manhattan Cryobank. They are dedicated to helping clients have healthy babies by analyzing a client's DNA in combination with the DNA of prospective sperm donors to provide the client with a personalized catalog of safer donor matches. In addition to donor sperm services, Manhattan Cryobank also offers a full range of andrology and fertility preservation services. And we also have IntegraMed Fertility. They are the largest network of fertility practices in the country. By combining the latest innovations in reproductive science with compassionate and customized treatment plans, IntegraMed practices are able to provide the very best possible care. We also have other great sponsors whose generosity allows us to bring you this show. So we ask, when choosing an infertility service provider, please consider choosing one from the Creating a Family directories, which you can find on the service provider page of our site. You can search by location, services provided, years in operation, just a whole host of other factors that we think are important when choosing. And by using these directories, you support those who support us, and we thank you. Today we're going to be talking about infertility and genetics, or more specifically, the genetic connection to infertility. Our guests are Dr. Piraye Beim. She is the founder of Celmatix, a women's health company using genomics and big data to help women and their doctors make more informed, proactive reproductive decisions. She also has a string of really interesting non-science awards, such as being a fellow of the Aspen Institute Health Innovators Fellowship Program and being named to Crane's 40 Under 40 list and being included as one of the top 15 founders disrupting their industry by Fortune. And we also have Dr. Alan Copperman. He is the managing partner at RMA of New York. That is one of the largest IVF centers in the country. And he is also the director of infertility at Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York. Welcome, Dr. Copperman and Dr. Beim, to Creating a Family.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
All right. Ever since the human genome was completely mapped in 2003, the importance and the interest in genetics has really skyrocketed. As I said at the very beginning, it's impossible now not to pick up any of the popular media or click on any website that has data or has follows science or any popular topic and not see information about genetics and the importance of genetics and how it really influences everything about us. And it turns out it also influences our fertility, which is absolutely fascinating. Dr. Beim, is it possible to say what percentage of infertility has a hereditary component?
I think we don't have a solid number for that because it's an area that we're still exploring. Personalized medicine, it's a very well-established and trodden path in oncology now. You mentioned that it's only been a decade, basically, since the first human genome sequence was even published. And I think the field that has really embraced personalized medicine the most, meaning using genetics to guide treatment decisions, is cancer. So now we have things like the BRCA gene mutations that you hear about that predispose people to breast cancer. And just a few weeks ago, the FDA approved the first drug that's targeted at a genetic alteration in a tumor rather than a clinical manifestation, so like a brain cancer or a breast cancer. So it's early days, and I think those are the numbers that are going to come out of, I think, the kind of work that we're doing.
Yeah, and so we don't really know yet with infertility. We're still early days. Well, I guess oncology is still early days too, but they're a little further along, and even they don't know the percentage of cancer cases that can be traced to genetics.
And I agree. Every disease is going to have some genetic predisposition or some ability to self-correct. And we think about endometriosis, age of menopause, age of puberty, incidence of fibroid, uteruses, male factor infertility. And I think that it's just by digging deeper into the code, by understanding large studies of people, by really asking these questions, we're going to be able to figure out what is a genetic predisposition and, frankly, what we could do about it. And that's what really excites me about the field of genomics and reproductive medicine.
Yeah, me too. I do find it very exciting. I find it's like we're standing on I don't know whether you would say on a cliff ready to jump or on the base of a mountain. We're only a couple of steps up, but there's so much to learn. And Dr. Copperman, I'm really glad you pointed out it's not just to learn it. It's also to be able to find new cures or to be able to help people who are struggling with the disease of infertility.
Right, it's on the cliff ready to see, I think, is the great analogy.
Yeah, okay, there you go. Yeah, I wasn't sure whether we wanted to, whether my analogy should be to jump or to climb. Let's talk about some of the medical conditions that can cause infertility in women that we know have a genetic base. Let's start with you, Dr. Beim. So what are some of the medical conditions that we know cause infertility, that we also know or believe have a genetic connection?
So one that comes to mind is POI, primary ovarian insufficiency. So that's a condition where the ovary stops functioning correctly before the age of 40, and it's a condition that can come before, for example, premature menopause. So there's been a growing evidence base that POI not only can have an environmental component, but definitely a genetic component, and it's known to run in families. Another condition is recurrent pregnancy loss. So these are the women who, unfortunately, rather than having one miscarriage and then potentially being able to conceive down the road, are having miscarriage after miscarriage. And so that's also been shown to have some genetic factors that can influence that kind of phenotype. So those are examples. I think Dr. Copperman mentioned endometriosis and others.
Yeah, I was just going to say, okay, and let me just also say that for some of our audience, POI is also sometimes called premature ovarian failure and goes by POF, just so there's no confusion. Dr. Copperman, you mentioned endometriosis. Let's talk a little bit about that. Do we believe that endometriosis runs in families or has a genetic base?
I think we're pretty convinced that there are some families that have generations that are afflicted by endometriosis. It's an enigmatic disease. It sometimes is based on the amount of disease and the body's response to it can cause pain, sometimes infertility, sometimes everything. Sometimes people have it and don't even know it. But clearly we have families that just in every generation the women have been affected, and we just have to begin to understand why some people express the disease differently, why some people react to these fairly normal endometriotic implants with inflammation and disease, and some it's completely benign.
All right, now we've talked some about female infertility. Let's talk a little about male infertility. Are there known medical conditions that have a genetic connection that would cause male infertility? Let's start again with you, Dr. Beim.
Yes. Again, the first one that comes to mind is non-obstructive azoospermia, which is a mouthful to say, but what it means is that a man doesn't have sperm, and that it's not due to a physical obstruction. And so there's been a mounting body of evidence showing that there are specific genetic alterations that can be pinpointed to explain why a man is not producing those gametes, those reproductive cells. So that's one strong example.
And Klinefelter syndrome is another one that often comes up when you because that's a genetic that one is also passed through families, is it not?
Yes, for sure. So there's I think maybe of interest to your audience, I think that there's a growing evidence base that the male can even influence something like the miscarriage on the female side, right? I think miscarriage is one of those really interesting things where a health condition that's impacting a woman is actually influenced by somebody else's genetics potentially, right? So these are, again, I think growing body of evidence. There's some clearer cases like on the azoospermia side, but I think even on the miscarriage side, unexplained infertility, et cetera, there's some really interesting data emerging showing that the genetics of the male can definitely impact those types of reproductive experiences.
And do we know, are we able to say, have we found the gene that, say, let's just take the example for, each of the examples you just mentioned with male, azoospermia or the connection for miscarriage. Have we been able to identify the place, exactly the genes or the collection of genes that are responsible for either of those? Dr. Beim?
Yeah, so there's actually thousands of papers that have looked at this, especially on the male side, and thousands of genes have been connected to this. You can also look at, for example, you can model this in a mouse. So if you look at a cohort of males in a clinical study who have, for example, azoospermia, and you suspect that there's actually a very specific genetic alteration that is driving this because, for example, that alteration comes up in all of the males who have azoospermia or a majority of them, but then very few males or none of the males who have normal semen parameters, you can actually go test that in a mouse. So you can make the same exact gene alteration if that gene is conserved in the mouse. And people have done this, and they've shown that when you do that experiment, then the mouse also has azoospermia. So these are the types of experiments that scientists and researchers and clinicians are doing to start to build out this alphabet or library of these genetic factors that can influence a person's reproductive potential.
All right, we got a question from Roberta, and it's very long, so I'm just going to paraphrase. She's asking about chromosome translocations. She's trying to understand the distinction. She knows that there can be chromosome translocations can cause infertility, but is this something that just happens spontaneously, or is it passed down from parent to child? I think that's a pretty good summary of Roberta's question. Dr. Copperman.
I think that's a great question. There are different things that we can test for in a parent and or in a potential parent, and we often target testing based on a history. So this specific question refers to translocation. In other words, if the person has the right amount of DNA, but some DNA has traded places, for example, from her 13th chromosome for her 21st chromosome and vice versa. So most of these translocations do indeed get passed on from family to family, and you have a family history of some miscarriages and some healthy babies. But some of them can indeed be de novo or brand new translocations. But in general, when we see a patient who has recurrent pregnancy loss, we check the karyotype or the chromosomal makeup of mom and of dad. And if we find a translocation or a rearrangement of DNA, it's actually not that hard these days to make an embryo, test an embryo, and make sure that the embryo has the correct chromosomal complement, and we can reduce, if not eliminate, the miscarriages to these couples that otherwise would suffer from miscarriages.
And here's a question, Dr. Copperman, from Marie. If my mother was infertile, do I stand a higher chance of being infertile?
Infertility, by definition, is a year of trying to conceive, and a woman's over the age of 35, 6 months of trying to conceive. But infertility can be related to eggs, sperm, uterus tubes, and other more complex and even more rare factors. There are some forms of infertility, like a premature aging of the ovaries, that mom went through menopause at 30, grandma went through menopause at 30, and sure enough, this woman is at risk of having infertility and might be a great candidate to freeze her eggs or try to conceive earlier or try to freeze embryos earlier for family planning. Many forms of infertility, such as, well, I'm 41 and my hormone levels aren't as good and I'm having a harder time trying to conceive, that's not something that necessarily runs in family. That's probably more physiological or normal human aging. Same thing as infertility related to blocked fallopian tubes. And many cases of low sperm counts really are sporadic and not necessarily. So I wouldn't either reassure someone, hey, don't worry, your family has gotten pregnant, you won't have a problem, or concern somebody and say, wow, your whole family has had difficulties, therefore you were. They're so multifactorial, and genetics are an important part of reproductive family planning and possibilities for patients, but they're only one factor. The environment and chance and the combination of factors, for example, a mild male factor and a mild egg factor may render a couple infertile, where a mild egg factor and somebody with a great sperm count may have a greater chance of having a healthy egg and a healthy sperm merge and implant and become a healthy ongoing pregnancy. So genetics is a component, but family history is neither overly reassuring nor should be overly concerning. It just should be part of a thorough history so that we can direct appropriate targeted testing and treatment.
Excellent. Dr. Beim, we've talked about premature ovarian insufficiency, or primary ovarian insufficiency, otherwise known as premature ovarian failure. Have we identified and when I say we, I don't mean me, you and the other scientists out there that are doing this research, have you identified where on the genome, is there a specific place, one or two genes, or is it a collection of genes? Do we know where to look to see if somebody is going to be at risk for POI or POF?
Yes. One thing that I maybe want to take a step back and mention is that risk does not equal destiny. Right, so we know that, per the comments that Dr. Copperman was sharing, that if you're 40, due to normal physiological changes in your body, it's going to be harder for the typical woman, right, the average woman to get pregnant. Right. But that's not true for every woman. And I think it's really important to think about and talk about genetic risk in the same way that we talk about other risk factors, right, that they're just that. It's a risk factor. It may be a statistically significant risk factor, but it's just a risk factor. It's not destiny. So I wanted to start with that. But with that in mind, yes, we have known for years that, for example, alterations in the control of a gene called the FMR1 gene have been associated with a higher risk of having POI, POF. And so women actually often get screened for that when they present in the clinic with the hormonal profile, et cetera, of someone with POI or POF. What we've been trying to do is expand that toolbox for physicians, because most women do not test positive for that genetic marker. And we feel that if a physician's going to the trouble of drawing a tube of blood, counseling a woman, starting this conversation about genetic risk, that they should really be screening a woman for all of the genetic risk factors that have a well-established evidence base backing them up now. So we did an exhaustive literature review. We at Celmatix did an exhaustive literature review of everything that's been published with respect to the genetic linkage of certain factors to POI, POF. And we found that while there were dozens of specific genetic loci that had been identified by researchers, ultimately it really came down to just 3 genes, in addition to FMR1, that we felt held up to study after study over time. And some of those other genes over time, as we and others study them more, may get elevated in the evidence base to things that we feel should now be used in the clinic. But today I would say there's probably about 4 things that a woman should be screened for. And FMR1 is one. And then there's also genes that, for example, we screen for at Celmatix with our genetic test Fertilome that look at factors that are involved in creating a follicle. And what has been shown, again, making the analogy back to the mouse, is that if you alter how that normal physiology works in the ovary generating a healthy follicle, you can actually model this in a mouse and show that a mouse will also develop POI or POF. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. You said there were 4 things. One is the genes that would connect or potentially connect to primary ovarian insufficiency. The other one is something that some genes that would connect to follicle creation. Is that just...
Well, so sorry, the genes that are connected to follicle creation. So FMR1, we don't understand why. It's a mystery.
Oh, okay.
It's a medical mystery. We know there's a correlation. In
Gotcha.
the case of the 3 other genes, we have a better understanding of potentially why, because we know that they're involved in healthy ovarian function, including through folliculogenesis. Gotcha.
Well, and we actually got a question from Bethany on what she calls premature ovarian failure, POF. She said, I was diagnosed with POF when I was 29. We went on to have 2 kids, one by adoption and one by egg donor. I have 2 sisters who are much younger than me. They have a different dad, but we have the same mother. Do they need to be worried about having POF? There's a lot to unpack in that question. And so let's see. Dr. Beim, I'm going to let you begin. I mean, the first question would be, is they have a different father, so that her sisters have a different dad. So does that impact your what you would recommend as to whether her sisters should be tested for the potential that they would also have POF?
So we believe if somebody has POF or has POF in their family, there's zero downside to just identifying and becoming aware of all of the risk factors. So if you know you're at risk, maybe you're somebody who doesn't want to wait until later to have children, or maybe you want to mitigate your risk by freezing your eggs or freezing embryos if you have a partner, or that's a path you want to take with donor sperm. It's one of those conditions where when you find out that you have it, there's not a lot you can do about it. So why not empower yourself earlier in your life with that information? Again, it's a risk factor. It's not destiny, just like age. But I think that the question about the father being different is really interesting because this is a situation where, often a physician will collect family history in the course of trying to screen for or, diagnose any disease. And what's interesting about reproductive conditions in women is that half of your DNA comes from your dad, but your dad didn't have a period. Your dad didn't go into menopause. And so, but your dad could have passed a genetic alteration down to you that impacts your periods or your age of menopause. And so sometimes I think women can have a false sense of security because their mother didn't have any difficulties. What they may not know is that it came down to their father's side. I actually experienced this myself where, I grew up thinking everything was going to be fine for me on my own reproductive journey because my mom kept saying, oh, the women in our family are so fertile, this is going to be easy for you. Later I struggled, and I actually was diagnosed with if you can think about it as a lighter form of POI, which is diminished ovarian reserve. And I actually tested positive for one copy of an alteration, which, I don't know if I got it from my mother or my dad, but it's one of the risk factors, one of these genes that I was talking about that impact folliculogenesis. And later when I got these genetic results and talked to my father, knowing I had inherited this from one of my parents, I said, when did your mom go into menopause? And he said, I don't know, but I think it was early. And it was just such an aha moment for me that we often don't talk to our fathers about the reproductive history of women and their family. And so one of the things we're trying to do is get women to have these conversations with the paternal lineage, if you will, talk to their aunts, talk to their cousins, talk to their grandmothers, and just really create that full picture for themselves. And then ultimately we feel women should also be empowering themselves with information about whether they are inheriting these risk factors from their families.
Such a good point about we do ignore, particularly with reproductive health, we ignore the male influence, and yet half of our genes come from that. From our dads, but I will say that I don't know that many men who would know when their mom, were your mom's periods regular? Oh, TMI, I do not know. That's what we would hear most often from men. So at this point, go talk to your grandmother and your aunts, and maybe perhaps skip your dad. I don't mean that seriously because actually your father may well know stuff, so you should at least start with him. All right, Dr. Copperman, we have a question from Jennifer. She wants to know, when does it make sense to do karyotype testing? I did the carrier map test recently, but wondered if I should do a karyotype test. We have unexplained infertility. I think we need to have you start by explaining the distinct. What is karyotype testing, and how does that differ from carrier map testing?
So karyotype testing involves checking your chromosomes, whether you have normally we would have 2 copies of chromosome 1, 2 copies of chromosome 2, etc., up until we get to the 23rd chromosome, which is the sex chromosome, and you either have an XX and or a female, or an XY and you're a male. So if a couple has miscarriages, for example, 2 or more, or even 3 or more miscarriages, then we would absolutely want to check to make sure there's no translocation. We were discussing that a little bit before. If a couple has a baby who's born with Down syndrome, for example, we would want to go back and see whether mom or dad had anything that would have predisposed them to having a baby with 47 rather than 46 chromosomes. So there are things that will tip us off. In general, for unexplained infertility, it's not considered standard of care to check the chromosomes. That being said, I can tell you anecdotally that I have seen patients that have had years of infertility, and we've gone back and we have found variants or some abnormalities. And so I don't think it's crazy to consider, but I'm not sure that insurance companies are going to pay for it or that it's considered, according to the textbooks, an indicated test. Carrier testing is interesting, and most patients these days are being counseled even before they get pregnant to consider doing some testing to see if they're at risk of having an unhealthy baby. For example, the American College of OBGYN recommends cystic fibrosis testing for a mom and a potential dad, or an egg source and a sperm source in the cases of donor gametes. And what we're looking for is not to see if mom or dad is sick, but to see whether or not they are at risk of passing on a mutation in one copy of the gene that codes for the protein that can be a problem in cystic fibrosis. And by testing mom and dad, even if they have a completely negative family history, 1 in 21 Caucasians carries a mutation in one of their 2 genes for cystic fibrosis. And if both mom and dad carry a mutation in the same gene, which is not that uncommon. It's 1 in 4 babies that are going to be affected by a pretty tough disease. And even though treatments are great, there's a lot of sickness that can be prevented by letting a couple know that they're at risk of having an unhealthy baby and by testing mom and dad. So karyotyping, even though these words sound similar, karyotyping is testing the chromosomes. Carrier testing, and whether that's Semaphore, which is Mount Sinai's 281 disease panel, or carrier mapping, or any of these other public companies that are now offering, LabCorp has a test too. That's to see whether a couple is at risk of having a baby who's affected by one of these genetic diseases. And we're seeing these panels expand dramatically. 10 years ago it was 3 diseases, now it's 281 diseases, and I'd say within the next 2 years, 3 years, there will probably be 500 to 1,000 diseases that we're going to be able to figure out whether a couple's at risk of passing on to their baby and potentially prevent unhealthy babies from being born.
Yeah, and as overwhelming as that seems, it's also really exciting because it gives you the power as a parent or a parent to be to do the best you can to assure that your child will not have some of these genetic abnormalities or genetic diseases. You are listening to Creating a Family. Today we are talking about infertility and genetics. Clout now ranks us as the number 2 online influencer in the area of infertility. We primarily hang out on Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest, and we'd love to have you join us. There are 3 ways to connect with us on Facebook. You can connect with me personally, which I'm Dawn.Davenport1, or you can like our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/creatingafamily, or you can join our very large and very active support group, and that you can find by facebook.com/groups/creatingafamily. Or, to be honest, the easiest way to find us is just to type in the words Creating a Family in the Facebook search box, and you can like the page and join the group. We also hang out on Twitter and Pinterest, and we go by @CreatingAFamily there. So join us. All right. Dr. Copperman, other than having an answer, is there a treatment advantage to knowing that your unexplained infertility has a genetic cause?
Well, that's a loaded question. I think that knowledge is power, and if it turns out that the male partner has no sperm, and it turns out that it's because he carries a mutation for cystic fibrosis and he's missing a vas deferens, and we should sequence the whole gene on mom to make sure they're not going to have an unhealthy baby. So we just follow the clues. So I always like information. If the couple has a risk for Fragile X, as Dr. Beim was discussing before, then that's information that we should use. And I'd say that over the next several years, we're going to have even more power stemming from the genetic profile of a patient. We may choose how much medication to give a woman. In a hospital, when an internist or a pain specialist is giving a dose of morphine, they actually figure out the patient's genetic makeup, and they dose the medication according to how the patient will metabolize. And that's brand new. That's this era of personalized and genomic medicine that's in front of us. So I don't think it's unreasonable to think that within the next couple of years we're going to have these personalized profiles, and it's going to help us target treatments of which patient should maybe freeze her eggs earlier, how much medication an infertile couple should take to optimally stimulate her ovaries, and what genes this couple has, and maybe if we're going to go through fertility treatment anyway, how can we test not only to make sure the baby has the correct chromosomal complement, but to make sure that the healthiest embryo gets chosen for transfer. So genetics is going to drive everything we do. We used to be reproductive surgeons, and then all operating was done in a dish over the last couple of decades when we put sperm into an egg, and now I believe that we're entering this genomic and mathematical and personalized era where somebody can come in with infertility, and not only can we treat the infertility, but maybe we could promote their having a healthy baby. And there are some people that think that procreation in the future is going to be too important to be left to the random mating of a sperm and an egg, and that may be a little bit of an exaggeration, but I think that a couple that needs our help, right now we're testing for more and more to make sure that we not only help them, but we prevent some preventable diseases.
Well, and I would also add, I don't dismiss the idea of just having an answer. One of the things that I think is so hard about unexplained infertility is, well, it's unexplained. You don't know the reason, and therefore it's hard to get your mind around and ultimately to resolve your infertility. I think so I think having an answer is not nothing. It's just so that you can point to and say, this is the cause. I think that's worth something. I guess it's up to each individual patient to decide how much it's worth, but I certainly think it's helpful in dealing with your infertility. Dr.
Dawn, in the genomics world, we call that the diagnostic odyssey, and that group of patients, the patients with unexplained infertility, that's the group that really inspired me to found Celmatix and to try to accelerate personalized medicine, precision medicine being adopted in this field. To me, it broke my heart that it's the patients who have great metrics and everything should be working well for them that end up in the system for the longest, right?
Yep.
And they end up doing every single test under the sun. Some of them end up doing every treatment under the sun. And as a basic science researcher, as a molecular geneticist who was previously in academia, I was learning about these cases, these unexplained infertility cases, and to me, that's when I had the aha moment of the power that genetics could bring to this field, is that we knew from the mouse models that we were working with in the laboratory that when you make a genetic alteration that impacts, for example, the quality of an egg in a mouse, that mouse otherwise, if you don't look with a special microscope inside the egg, it looks totally fine. It has normal menstrual cycles. The eggs look beautiful. You can fertilize the eggs, but they just don't implant or they don't develop or they miscarry. And so I just asked the kind of, I thought, naive question at a symposium one day, which is, hey, there's this revolution happening in oncology, and I had seen it, I was on the ground floor of this revolution in graduate school when I was at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. And I said, previously physicians would be scratching their heads and saying, why are these patients responding to this lung cancer drug and these patients not? And it turns out that genetics and understanding on a subclinical level, so meaning really what's going on inside the cell, inside the organ on a molecular level, that made it no longer a mystery. And I said, okay, so who's doing this for women's health? Who's doing this for reproduction? And the answer was no one was really going after this in a way that would translate that to tools that physicians could actually use. I mean, thousands of studies now have been performed, funded by, government research dollars done at top centers around the country. But I didn't see anybody really fighting for women to have access to this information. And to me, it just felt like a no-brainer. And so I think it's early days, but we've already seen for women who have had access to the kind of genetic information that's on our Fertilome genetic test, which is the world's first multi-gene panel test for reproductive conditions that are also related to infertility. We've seen physicians who have these cases where they're at a dead end. They've tried everything, or they've tried all of to Dr. Copperman's point, all of the standard of care has been tried, right? They did the right thing for this patient. They followed the guidelines, and they don't know what to do next. And with the genetic test, for example, the genetic test could show that a woman actually has a number of alterations in pathways related to immune function. And we've had physicians who that's been a light bulb moment for them, and they've tried something a little different in the protocol, and the woman got pregnant. Or they see that, Dr. Copperman mentioned endometriosis is this nebulous thing that often goes undiagnosed because technically the only way you can really diagnose it is to do surgery, which is, invasive and not always something that a physician wants to do as a first line. And if they test positive for one of the risk factors for endometriosis, that may trigger a different, what should we try next? Well, maybe we treat this as an endo case. Maybe you try a different diet. You try to get inflammation under control. We take a little break, and then we try again after. And so this is it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg, right? In a perfect world, I think for physicians who want to be evidence-based, want to offer standard of care, of course they should do those things first, right? And we believe, like Dr. Copperman was saying, that these genetic factors are going to be part of that standard of care. not that far in the future, literally months to years down the road, I think as these studies emerge, linking these genetic factors to particular interventions, we'll see it become standard of care. But even in the meantime, if physicians don't have access to this information in a clinical setting, those protocols are not going to emerge. Those aha moments are not going to happen, right? And so we really, we're trying to support the physicians. Now we have over 50 physicians in the U.S. who are utilizing this new genetic insight and revealing this information as part of trying to deal with some of these hardest cases, or, to your point, just trying to give a woman peace of mind that this wasn't, quote-unquote, her fault necessarily. Right?
Or
and
closure,
we hear this
so that
a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
Or they have that closure. I agree with you. There's tremendous value in ending that diagnostic odyssey. And again, as a woman, I draw from my own experience. But the three things I struggled with on my reproductive journey were endometriosis, miscarriage, and diminished ovarian reserve. And when I got my Fertilome genetic test results, those were the three things I tested positive for having risk factors: miscarriage, POI, and endometriosis. And that's an N of 1, but for me, I found great peace in that. And anyway, so I think it's a powerful new era that we're moving into.
Yeah, an exciting one. We have a question from Tara. And Dr. Copperman, I'm going to direct this one to you. She says, I am able to get pregnant but can't stay pregnant. I don't know whether this qualifies me as infertility, but it feels that way to me since I can't have kids. Let me stop and interject. Tara, yes, that qualifies you as infertile, at least in my book. She goes on, the last 2 miscarriages, they tested the fetus, and there were chromosomal problems. Does this mean that our miscarriages are caused by my or our screwed up genes, or is this something happening to the baby during conception? I did contact her to get more information, and she has had 5 miscarriages, all in the first trimester. So, Dr. Copperman, what would you tell somebody like Kara? Now, she's had 5 first trimester miscarriages, and she wants to know what are the odds that it's something that's just happening during conception, or the odds are that it's something that she or her husband are passing down.
Well, first of all, I'm just so sorry. That is a horrible story, and I know that the amount of suffering from one miscarriage can cause, and I would encourage her that over time it really is likely to work for them, but it certainly is time to start asking the basic questions. So starting from the top, this whole definition of infertility that we talked about before, I don't think we should make somebody prove that they're infertile. I mean, if somebody wants to have a baby, then we have issues, and we should lobby for coverage for them, and we should advocate for testing and treatment for them. So,
yes, I agree.
The workup of infertility, we talk about eggs, sperm, uterus, and tubes. The workup for miscarriage, we look for structural issues, hormonal issues, infectious issues, immunological. But ultimately, most miscarriages are caused by unhealthy eggs, and that's statistically. And we don't look for blaming, is it an egg thing or a sperm thing? But I think part of what we should be doing is using the data to support targeted diagnostics and start targeted therapeutics. So the first thing that I would do if I hear about multiple miscarriages, I would take a history. I do a physical examination, and I would do a transvaginal ultrasound and normally look for, and including a 3-dimensional ultrasound, and make sure that there's not a fibroid. I could think of one patient who had 5 miscarriages. I put in an ultrasound. I'm like, oh, my goodness, you have a 3-centimeter submucosal fibroid. I resected the fibroid, and she had a healthy baby after that. And in part it was frustrating that it had gotten to that point. In part it was just wonderful that we had the technology, and ultimately she had a healthy baby. But most likely, in a couple like you're discussing, either it's going to turn out she's around the age of 40, and when you're in your 20s, 90% of the eggs are normal, and in your 40s, 90% of the eggs are unhealthy. And a lot of these unhealthy eggs are fertilizing and implanting but don't have the right genetic instructions, so therefore are miscarrying. So it could be diminished ovarian reserve. Alternatively, it could be, just as we discussed before, a translocation. She or her husband could have a rearrangement of DNA that predisposes them to having an unhealthy embryo. I would definitely encourage her that this is not her fault, that there's nothing that she's done wrong. It's not that she's too stressed. It's not that she's working too hard. It's not that she's not taking good enough care of herself. But I'd go back, take a thorough history and physical. I'd evaluate the uterus. I'd look for the karyotype in mom and dad. and ultimately be hopeful that they are getting pregnant, and over time, either with assistance or maybe even naturally, it could work.
All right. We have a question from Lorraine, or Lorianne. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. And I really find this one to be an interesting one. She said, I have suffered from infertility for many years. I was finally able to get pregnant and now have 11-year-old boy-girl twins. I may be overreacting, but I wonder if I should have my children, both of them, tested to see if they have inherited our infertility. I think I would like to know this. I think I would have liked to know this information when I was a teen, because I may have made different decisions. All right, there's a lot in this question that I find interesting. Doctor, I would like to have both of your input. I'm going to start with you, Dr. Beim. She doesn't say the cause of her infertility. Would she likely be able to find out if both her daughter and her son are at higher risk for infertility by doing genetic testing?
Well, so I think it's early days. I think that I personally, I don't know if 11 is the right age to screen for it. I have to put on my scientist hat right now. And with my scientist hat on, what I would say is that the evidence base is still evolving. I think that the good news is they're 11, and I think that we're going leaps and bounds. So probably by the time they're of reproductive age, a lot of this is going to be worked out. And yes, I do think that once that is worked out, it will make sense for the whole family to be tested and get a sense of whether the difficulties that the mother had, especially if they weren't, to Dr. Copperman's point, things related to, tubal factor or something like that, but they had unexplained infertility or a reproductive condition like endometriosis. I think that it could be extremely empowering for their children to have that information earlier in their lives. Now I'm going to put my mom hat on because I have a daughter and I have two boys. And when I was pregnant with my daughter, I was joking with people that I wish I could have her tested even when she was just a fetus for whether I had passed these markers onto her, because one of the things that we know, these markers that predisposed me for some of the genetic, for some of the reproductive struggles that I've had. The reason I wanted to know even when I was just pregnant with her, again, now just putting on my biologist hat and my mom hat, is that we know that the endowment of eggs that a woman will have for her whole life, that starts at the fetal stage, right? And there's that's when that endowment is built up. And things that I exposed her to in utero, together with the genetic risk that she had, could actually end up impacting potentially her fertility down the road. And so I think that again, it's early days, and I want to be clear that I'm not saying everyone should go have their fetus tested for genetic risk factors, but that's just a personal decision. If that was something easy to do, I would have known, because you can't mitigate every risk factor, right? You can't. I couldn't during my pregnancy. I can't during her lifetime save her from everything. But I think the power of genetics is knowing where you should invest your credit card, if you will, with respect to your genetic risk. If you know that your children are predisposed to cancer, but not predisposed to cardiovascular disease or infertility, then you probably should focus on cancer risk factors and empowering them with that. Sometimes the risk factors are overlapping, but if you don't have cancer as a risk factor, but you have infertility as a risk factor, then maybe that's something that you want to focus on. And so just understanding, what is the profile that my child has, to me is very important. I think it's something that I am going to, when the time is right, try to reveal in my children, because I think, especially when you're in that category of woman who's getting this information revealed to you at the end of the diagnostic odyssey or after you're already experiencing the condition, there is a little bit of that feeling of, I wish I had known this up front, if only to manage my expectations, or if only to have financially prepared for the fact that eventually I may need to have fertility treatments. You end up not manifesting the risk factor, great, you've put that money away, spend it on something else, right? Or you put the eggs away as your insurance, but then you have no trouble getting pregnant spontaneously, fine. That's a much better scenario in my book than not doing those things, not mitigating risk factors that are important to you, and then finding out that it's too late, and then saying, wait a minute, why didn't anyone ever tell me that I was at risk, right? That would be as absurd in my mind as a woman trying to conceive for the first time at 46, being unable, and then being, saying, well, nobody ever told me it gets harder to conceive with age. Why didn't somebody tell me this, right? A woman can choose to take on that risk, but again, I think she needs to be empowered with that information. Some of those were just my personal thoughts, kind of putting on my mom hat. I think putting on my evidence-based hat, what I would say is it's probably a little premature to screen her children for infertility at age 11, but I think we'll get there very quickly.
One question I have as well, and we've recently had a doctor on. She was both a pediatrician and a pediatric medical geneticist, and we talked about the ethics of testing children. And I have, I'm not sure, and I am not an expert on this, and so I would love to hear if both of you, if you have thoughts on this. But I'm not sure a geneticist, I'm not sure would be able. I'm not sure it would be considered ethical to run the test on your children. I'm not certain. Dr. Copperman, again, this is probably outside of everybody's area of expertise, certainly mine. Any thoughts on
Well,
this?
I think that we do indeed have standards for tests, and I think that we want to make sure that the test is actionable. In other words, if we're going to do something about it, that we're ethical, that we're actually going to making a decision on behalf of the person being tested, especially when you're talking about a pediatric patient population. So we will have tremendous access to information in the future. I'd say that between knowing what we're at risk of passing on, having a maternal blood draw and finding out information, doing a newborn heel stick, and a lot of our future is indeed genetically determined, and we're heading in the direction. But right now, I'd say that we're not quite ready to tell an 11-year-old who's just got the whole world in front of her that we think that someday, decades from now, she's gonna struggle with fertility. And I don't think it's fair. We certainly don't have the data to support telling her something that may or may not be true. I mean, you look at the revolution in the last 2 weeks that we're using CRISPR-Cas9 in a laboratory, but fixing DNA inside of an embryo. So yes, we need more information. I understand, going back to the patient's question, wanting to not have their children suffer from what they suffered from, and that we are entering an era of more rather than less information. But no, we're not quite there where we can have our kids tested for infertility, and to a point where we either have to make a decision to tell them or to not tell them, both of which are very complicated at this point. But these are great ethical questions to be bringing up, and it's only through discourse such as this that we can help vector towards making the right decision.
Yeah, I would just say the show that we did, and it was just a couple of weeks ago, was absolutely fascinating. It was all about the ethics. I have continued to think about it, and we've continued to be discussing it in the support group. It's really fascinating. We've got a question from Julia about epigenetics, which is not exactly on topic. And let me pause now and say that not only could the topic of epigenetics support an entire show, but we will be doing a show, we hope, in Q4, latter part of Q4 of this year, the fourth quarter of this year, on epigenetics. But just so that we get Julia's question in, Dr. Copperman, she wants to know, what do we know about epigenetics now? How much does the woman carrying the baby influence the baby, even if she's not the genetic mom? And let's give the crib note version, because, as I said, you could talk on this, I am sure, for a good hour. But just so we get Julia's question answered.
Dawn, you have sophisticated patients. So we've talked a lot. We've talked a lot today about the DNA, and DNA is basically it's like a phone book. I mean, you read it. These are letters. These are A's, T's, G's, and C's. But the question that you're asking is, what controls whether that phone book gets read? What does DNA expression looks like? And that is this field of epigenetics, of what is which of these genes are turned on, which of these genes are turned off, how and when those things happen. And the question, I'm guessing, is related to somebody who's carrying a donated egg, for example. And while it's not her DNA that she's going to be passing on to the baby, what we are learning is that maternal health and wellness do make a difference. In other words, if the the recipient, the intended parent, the woman who's receiving donated eggs, is carrying the baby and she focuses on health and wellness. She's not obese, she's not hypertensive, she exercises, she takes care of herself, she gets sleep, she takes prenatal vitamins. I mean, just think about prenatal vitamins. She could prevent a neural tube defect, a spina bifida, by taking a vitamin. That's a perfect example of somebody's predisposed to something potentially, and you could prevent that gene from being expressed, that disease from causing the fetus. So we are learning so much about carrying a baby and the health of the baby. So I think this has changed the way a lot of people think about receiving donor eggs. There are some women that just don't have healthy eggs, and they do want to become a mom, and they do want their partner's sperm to be part of the generational instructions that their children have, and they struggle with how will they contribute to the health and wellness of the baby, and the answer probably is more than we had ever imagined. And being healthy and taking good care of herself and controlling the delivery with good obstetrical care and breastfeeding the baby and bonding with the baby and being, I mean, all of that transfers immunity, it transfers a comfort, and almost miraculously it seems to change the gene expression pathways to promote health and wellness of a baby. And that's changed the conversation we have when people are deciding, when women are deciding whether or not to accept donor eggs as a treatment option.
You are exactly right. The field of
It's a great question.
It's super important, both to, in particular, we see the question come up with parents who are considering donor egg and donor sperm as well. All right, Dr. Beim, how can women and men find out in advance if they have a greater risk for infertility because of their genes? Or even if it's not in advance, let's say they haven't conceived and they're beginning treatment, how do they find out what their risk factor is for their genetic risk factors are, I should say?
Well, I think the field is growing. We introduced the first multi-gene panel test for the risk factors that we think have the highest evidence base. So let me just give you a sense of the work that went into the genetic test, which is called Fertilome, that we developed. So we screened over 25,000 publications that were, in the public domain in medical journals. We narrowed that down to about 5,000 independent studies that looked at genetic risk with respect to reproductive conditions. And what that mapped to, when we mapped that onto the human genome, is over 17,000 individual genetic locations on the genome in some way, shape, or form have been identified through these thousands of studies as potentially impacting somebody's genetic risk on the female side. We know on the male side through similar work that list is similarly, in the thousands. And what we did on the female side is we then said, okay, so there's, 17,000 things is a lot of things to screen for, and ultimately not all of these things are going to hold up in study after study or in different ethnic populations or over time. And so what we did was we narrowed those studies down to we narrowed the genetic factors that someone could be screened for down to the really handful where they had been tested in multiple different studies over time in independent study groups, and that those correlations had held up. So we independently statistically validated these things, and where we ended up was that there were about 32 genes that survived that rigorous statistical validation and analysis, and that's just on the female side. We don't have a test on the male side. There are some laboratories who offer some genetic testing, not necessarily the kind of multi-gene panel test that we've developed, but they're out there. I think that the field is rapidly evolving. I think that we have pushed the envelope forward for women, and I think on the male factor side, we or others will do that in the future as well. But I think that we're not proposing that everyone on planet Earth gets tested for these things, but I think people who have existing risk factors, so people who know they want to wait until later to either start their family or expand their family past the age when they're starting to accumulate that genetic risk or that age-related risk. So to Dr. Copperman's point that he's made earlier, if you infertility is very complex. right? If you are going to have, if you just want to have 2 kids and you're getting started at 22, should you get genetically tested for your risk factors? Probably not as a first pass, because most 22-year-olds don't have trouble getting pregnant. If you're like a lot of women in the United States and around the world who, that's not part of your life plan, and you want to wait until later so you know you're adding risk factors, or if you know you have risk factors because you've spoken to the women on your father's side of the family, or your father is aware of risk factors among the women in his family, or your mother had infertility or fertility difficulties, and you think, I know I have risk factors already, I want to empower myself with additional ones, then I do think that a test like the Fertilome genetic test could be very appropriate. Again, for someone just to understand, because so many people wish they had that hindsight. And we hear this all the time. And even for patients who are undergoing treatment, when everything that could have gone wrong in treatment ends up going wrong for them, and then it's at that point, to kind of maybe get that clarity and that closure, they get tested, and they test positive for 8 different things that have been linked to reproductive conditions, and they're an outlier. What we've heard from their physicians is, gosh, I wish I had access to this earlier in the treatment process, because I like to be upfront with my patients. I don't like them to be surprised. And if I saw this many genetic alterations, would I have said to them IVF is not going to work for them? No. I don't think that's we're not there yet to be able to say something like that. But I may have managed expectations. We may have redefined success. And so I think those things can be incredibly empowering.
And I know that Celmatix is doing a partnership with 23andMe, which I find really interesting. I'm not sure I understand, though, what is it you're hoping to find. I certainly know that 23andMe has certainly got a huge database. So what are you hoping to find? Because they do different type of testing, 23andMe is. So what do you hope to find with by partnering with them?
Well, our partnership really had 2 goals. One is that they have an amazing group of users of their platform. About 80% of the people who have been tested on their platform have agreed to have their genetic information and the surveys that they filled out about things like, did I have trouble conceiving, used for research. So it's about 80% of their community. And so what that means is that we can look at, for example, 80,000 women who have had a miscarriage. We can look at 20,000 women who have been diagnosed with endometriosis. These numbers, looking at these genetic alterations on that scale, can really, really move the field and what we're trying to do forward very, very quickly. So that's one thing, is we're partnered with them because they, similarly to us, believe that patients and women and individuals should be empowered with genetic information and be proactive in managing their health based on these risk factors. And so we have alignment on that. The other thing that we've been able to do in partnership with them is to launch a 4,500 woman study, which is unprecedented. We're tracking 4,500 women who have either recently conceived or who are actively trying to conceive. And what 23andMe did was they helped us increase awareness among their highly engaged user community that we were going to do, Celmatix was going to conduct this study. And so we've been able to, it was amazing. We had 1,000 women a day sign up for the study. We actually overshot, our goals. And
that's a good problem to have.
It's a great problem to have, but I think everyone was just not surprised but amazed and delighted at how many women raised their hand. And 1,000 a day signed up and said, I want to be involved in this future for women. I don't want the next generation of women, or even me later in my life, to have a question mark about these things. I want clarity. But what's really interesting about that data set is not only are we looking at the genetic factors, so very similar to the studies that power, for example, is this Fertilome genetic test that we have right now, but we're also looking at environmental risk. We're asking these women what they eat. Are they jet lagged? We're asking questions about their male partners. What drugs are they taking? And the synergy and the intersection of those environmental factors, the lifestyle factors, and the genetics, I think that's really going to take the field to the next level.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And Dr. Copperman, the last question to you, and it's from Mike, and I'm only going to ask one part of it because it's a lengthy question, and we're running out of time. He's wondering if using ICSI, intracytoplasmic sperm injection, as treatment for male infertility is increasing the likelihood that the sons of couples who use ICSI or more likely to be infertile? I.e., are we making it easier to pass on a genetic abnormality to the next generation? So not necessarily an easy question to end on, but there you go.
I think it's a great question. I think that sometimes we focus a lot on female infertility almost a little bit too much, and with male factor infertility accounting for almost half of the reason, either alone or in combination, why couples are having difficulties conceiving, I think it's important that we never forget the male. We always test the sperm. If the sperm count's abnormal, I think it's reasonable to have an evaluation with a reproductive urologist. We could look for environmental reasons, genetic reasons, hormonal reasons, structural reasons why the sperm count is low or absent. So overall, it's important to evaluate the male, both with a test and possibly with a visit. When we do find abnormalities, we can overcome most male factor infertility by taking a sperm and putting it right into the egg, and ICSI is being done more commonly. But the specific question I think that the patient's asking is if there is a piece of DNA missing on the Y chromosome, right in the area that codes for telling a guy's testicles how to make sperm, then that Y deletion, as it's called, can indeed be passed on. So this man would never, ever be able to get his partner pregnant, and using in vitro fertilization with intracytoplasmic sperm injection, we can help that couple have babies. But the sons, in that specific case, may also have reproductive challenges and may need the same procedure. But if that's the worst-case scenario, is that the son will need the same thing as the dad did, then I don't consider it a major obstacle or reason to not use all the technology possible to help that couple get pregnant. So the answer is yes, in specific circumstances we might be passing on the reason for infertility, but those cases are rare, and that's probably not a reason to refrain from using the technology to help have the baby that the child wants to have.
Excellent response. And let me remind our audience to keep in mind that the information given in this interview is general advice. To understand how it applies to your specific situation, please work with your infertility professional. Thank you so much, Dr. Beim and Dr. Copperman, for being with us today. For our audience, to get more information about Dr. Beim or Celmatix or their genetic test, Fertilome, you can go to their website, Celmatix.com. That's CELMATIX.com. To get more information about Dr. Copperman or RMA New York, you can go to their website, which is RMANY.com. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I will see you next week.
Let's say you just bought a house. Bad news is, you're one step closer to becoming your parents. You'll proudly mow the lawn. Ask if anybody noticed you mowed the lawn. Tell people to stay off the lawn. Compare it to your neighbor's lawn. And complain about having to mow the lawn again. Good news is, it's easy to bundle home and auto through Progressive and save on your car insurance, which, of course, will go right into the lawn. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company, affiliates, and other insurers. Discount not available in all states or situations. And now, an ad from Dad.
All right, save money on car insurance when you bundle home and auto with Progressive. Can I take these off? All right. What is this? This looks good. Wow, that's well made. Where did you get this? I'm talking to you with the hair. Yeah, where did you get this? It's good stuff. That's solid. That's not veneer. That's solid stuff.
Progressive can't save you from becoming your parents, but we can save you money when you bundle home and auto. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company, affiliates, and other insurers. Discounts not available in all states or situations.